So today I'm going to talk about spelling the chords. I've made some videos and I noticed that a lot of times I'm like spelling out the chords like C, E, G, like it's C major, C, E, G, or like C minor, C, E flat, G, or G minor, G, B flat, D, or A, C sharp, E, or whatever. And you know, when I was first starting out, if somebody was doing that, either I would have thought they were a big show off, or I would have just been amazed, like, oh my God, it must have taken years to learn how to spell all these like individual voicings and stuff. But in reality, it's really like easy to do. It's just a basic system. And I'll kind of just talk in this video about how I do it, how to visualize it. You got to know some really basic stuff. So you got to know like the alphabet, the first 7 letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You got to know how to say the alphabet, but skipping a letter. So you go A, and then skip B, and then C, and then skip D and E. So A, C, E, and then G, and then you skip A because it starts at A. You go to B, D, F, and then A, C, E, G, B, D, F, A, C, E, G, B, D, F, like that. And the last thing you got to know is a light switch. I'll talk about that later. But you got to know that it's either on or off, and it must be either on or off. It can't be in some weird third state. That's basically it. If you know that, you can do this, I think. So yeah, I'll talk to you a little bit about some other videos I've seen about this topic. Other approaches that I think, maybe for me anyway, don't work as well. One of them was you just have a big chart, and like across the top, there's like the different chord qualities, so major, minor, augmented, diminished for triads, and then down the column, down the column, there's all the different notes, so A sharp, B, C, C sharp, etc. And that generates a list of like 48, so like 4 times 12 different chords you have to memorize. It's quite a daunting task to have to memorize all that stuff like at once. I guess you sort of break it down. But I think my system is a bit more like logical than that, and you understand how the things are built. And you don't have to have this big like chart of information in your head. You just know how to build it at the moment that you need it. So it's more efficient that way too. Another method I've seen is people advocate like visualizing the cycle of fifths, which is fine. But for me personally, like that's really tough. It's really hard for me to have like that much like information in my mind at once, because then they define the chords as like, you know, if you think of the cycle of fifths as a clock, and then like you have a minute, second, and hour hand on the clock, right? And then they define the chords as like the hands being in different positions to point to the different notes on the cycle of fifth. So then you have to memorize like major chord, it's a certain like angles and stuff, and minor chord, it's a different one. And then you have to be able to rotate those positions like precisely to be able to spell the chords. I guess some people can do that if they have really like good visual memory or working space, but for me that's quite difficult, so I can't do that. It doesn't work for me at all. So again, my thing's a little bit different. Like the basic thing I do is just I know the chords in C major, like all natural notes, and then I know how to make any other chord like analogous to a chord in C major and how to change that chord to get the chord I want. In order to do that, instead of having like a giant table or a large table of information in your mind all together at once, or like the kind of cycle of fifths diagram with 12 notes around it, and then knowing how to rotate the hands on the clock to get the chord you want. Basically, you just need these kind of like smaller bits of information, and then you combine them. And when you combine them, that gives you whatever info, like whatever chord you want to spell in the moment. So in this case, you're going to need to know the chords of C, like all 7 chords of C, and kind of know that quite well, and then whether those chords are major or minor or diminished. And then you need to know, like in general, what the formula is for major chords, minor chords, diminished chords. I guess I'll just cover major, minor, and diminished in this video, but like augmented is kind of the odd man out a little bit because it's not in the diatonic scale. But if you understand major, minor, diminished, and then you know like how to make an augmented chord, it's going to be easy to do. It's like second nature basically once you understand the basics. So I'll turn to each of those topics in the rest of this video. So the first thing to think about is the chords in the key of C. And before we think about that, let's think about the notes in C. So it just goes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then the 8th note is C, and then once you get to that 8th note, that octave, you can just keep going, so D, E, F, etc. The nice thing about C is that there's no sharps or flats to have to worry about, so it works like almost like a nice template that you can kind of build any other scalar chord from the key of C by adding sharps or flats as you need to. To build each chord, you just skip a note in the sequence. So if you start like if you say like, we want to build a C major chord, for example, you start with C, and then the next note is D, you skip that, so then you include E, and then the next note is F, you skip that, and then you include G, so you go C, E, G. You could keep going and build longer and longer chords, so if you added like the B, you'd have a C major 7 chord, and then the next one D, like C major 9, but we're just going to limit the discussion to triads for the purposes of this video. And if you understand like what we're doing in the video, then you can easily add as many notes and extensions and so on as you want once you understand the basics. So I've got a chart at the bottom that shows each of the chords in C, how they're spelled out. So like we said, C is C, E, G, D is D, F, A, E is E, G, B, F is F, A, C, G is G, B, D, A is A, C, E, and B is B, D, F. And again, those are just spelled by like starting at that note, like starting at A, for example, and then skipping to C, and then skipping to E, or starting at B, then skipping to D, and then skipping E, and then going to F, so B, D, F. Okay, so at this point, it's important to keep in mind that you probably want to be pretty comfortable just naming these 3-note chords, triads. So whenever somebody says C, you want to kind of automatically think C, E, G. Whenever somebody says E, you want to think E, G, B. When they say G, G, B, D. When they say B, you think B, D, F. When they say D, you think D, F, A. When they say F, you think F, A, C. So like kind of knowing those sequences of letters should be like more or less automatic, hopefully. And the more you automatize that knowledge, the easier time you're going to have building the chords on the spot later on when I explain how to do that. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is that each note has a root, a third, and a fifth, as indicated on the chart. So in the case of C, the C is the root, the E is the third, and the G is the fifth, and it just refers to the scale position. So like we said, when you're spelling a C chord, you have to skip those notes. So C, like the D is 2, you skip that, and then the E is 3, so that's why 3 is the third, E is the third, so C, E, so root to third, and then you skip F, F is the 4, and then you land on G, and that's the fifth, so it's root, third, and fifth. And the same, for example, if you do D, you're just taking D as your root, and then you skip E, which is the second, or the second, I was going to say the ninth, it's the second. And then you go to F, which is the third, in this case it's a minor third, but it's like the 3, and then you skip G, which is the 4, and then you go to A, which is the 5 of D. So again, like D would have D, F, A, root, third, fifth. And that's the same with how these triads are spelled. Just keep in mind that you start with root, then you go third, and then you go fifth. So now that you know how to spell each individual chord in the key of C, the next thing that's really important to know is there's like 3 groups of chords based on the quality. So there's 3 qualities are major, minor, and diminished. Hopefully you're familiar with the terms already. Basically, the major chords sound kind of happy and resolved. The minor chords, are usually characterized as sounding sad. And the diminished chord, people they're like, oh, they're evil. They sound really like unresolved. They want to move on to something that sounds more stable. They each sound differently. There's 3 groups of chords. Any major key has these 3 groups of chords in it. And so we're in C major, so C major key has these 3 groups. There's 3 chords that are major, 3 major chords, 3 minor chords, and 1 diminished chord. The major chord is C major, F major, and G major. The minor chords are A minor, D minor, and E minor. And the diminished chord is B diminished. So all this information, you also kind of need to have automatic at your fingertips, just to know that like if someone says F, you're thinking F-A-C in the key of C, and that's a major chord. Or if someone says G, you're thinking G-B-D in the key of C, and that's a major chord. If somebody says A, you think A-C-E, that's in the key of C, it's a minor chord. If somebody says E, you think E-G-B, and in the key of C, that is a minor chord. Somebody says B, you think B-D-F, in the key of C, that's a diminished chord. Hopefully, if you're playing guitar anyway, a lot of this info is probably already familiar. Maybe you notice that whenever you learn to play the chords of a song, if you play like a C major chord, you're also likely in the same song going to play an F major chord or a G major chord. It's kind of rare maybe that you would have a C major with a G minor. The C to G minor is kind of a nice sound though, even though it might not be very common. So here it is, C major, and then G minor. So I heard that song that sounds to me like Foo Fighters, song called Learn to Fly, I think it's called. And they go like C major, then G minor, and then F. On the recording though, maybe they're just tuned down a half step, or maybe they're just playing it a half step lower. So what I hear on the recording is B major, F sharp minor, E major. Of course, like F minor is a nice possibility in C major, but usually it'll go like F major, then F minor, and then resolve back to C. Example progression with F minor, maybe you know this one. Sounds like Radiohead, but I think on the original recording he plays it in E. So he goes E major, G major, G sharp major, then A major, A minor, then back to E major. And there's definitely exceptions to the rules, but maybe you've already noticed that there's patterns. Like if you play a C and you want to go to a minor chord, it's probably going to be an A minor, an E minor. A minor might take you to D minor, things like that. So probably these families of chords are already familiar in some way. B is usually the odd one out, the B diminished. Nobody likes to talk about the B diminished chord, but it's super important to know it if you want to be able to easily spell chords. Because there's lots of chords that begin with B or B flat that aren't diminished, and so we're going to use the diminished to kind of springboard into being able to spell those chords. And also just be aware that if you're playing a G7, the B diminished is quite common because it's the last three notes of a G7 chord. So G7 is G, B, D, F, and it's very common to play a G7 to resolve it to the one chord C. And so whenever you play G7, you're playing 75% of that chord is the B diminished chord. Okay, so now we come to the light switch thing, which I think maybe is the insightful part of this video. Everything else you can read in any other like basic theory book up to this point. And this was the part when I started thinking of it this way that it really helped me like generate the chords quickly in my mind. So the idea is simply this: you think of the chord as the root, and then the third is the light switch that's either on or off, and the fifth is a light switch that's either on or off, right? So root's always the same. The third, when it's on or in the up position, that means it's a third, like a natural third. When it's down or in the off position, that means it's a flat third. And the fifth, same thing. When it's in the up position, when it's on, that means it's natural five, just five. And when it's down, that means it's flat five. So you can use this kind of light switch metaphor to visualize any chord. So a major chord, by definition, is root 3, 5. So in other words, root and then up or on, up or on. A minor chord is root, flat third, and 5. So it looks like root and then down or off and then up for the 5. And then the diminished chord is defined as root and then down, so flat third, down, flat 5. So if you could kind of just see what those switch combinations look like, and there are only two switches, so it's pretty easy to know. Visually, it's really, convenient, I guess. So just major is just root up, up, minor is root down, up, and diminished is root down, down. Now that we have these like visual ideas about what the chords look like with the switch metaphor, let's go ahead and match the three categories, major, minor, and diminished in the key of C to these switch diagrams. So once again, you see the major chords, C, E, G, F, A, C, G, B, D, and that's root up, up. The minor chords, A, C, E, D, F, A, and E, G, B, and that's root down, up. And the diminished chord, B, D, F, that's root down, down. So that's simple, right? Now though, like we're ready to go ahead and build any chord that we can imagine or any triad. As long as it's a major, minor, diminished triad, we can build it by making an analogy to a chord in the key of C that you already know. So let's go ahead and say like, maybe we want to just start out simple, and what about like a C minor triad? So we know the first thing is we just go, okay, we know C major triad, C, E, G, and that's because it's major, it goes root up, up. To make it minor, you just take that middle switch and flip it down. So we know that it's E, C, E, G, so when you flip it down to the flat third, it becomes E flat. So C, E flat, G is the C minor triad. And then if we wanted to take it a step further and make it C diminished, so now we have C minor, C, E flat, G. So you just, in the diminished, is the fifth, you'd flip that down to a flat 5. So G becomes G flat, and it's C, E flat, G flat. And that's how you know, like C major, C, E, G, C minor, C, E flat, G, C diminished, C, E flat, G flat. Just kind of flipping those switches and adding the flat to make it, you know, when you go from natural 3 to flat 3, you have to flat that note. How about another example? B diminished. And maybe we want to do B major and we want to do B minor. So we know that BDF is a diminished chord. That's kind of our given that we have to know because we know all the chords in the key of C. When it starts with B, BDF, that's diminished in the key of C. We want to make, well, let's start out with this. We know that diminished is root and then off, off, right? We want to make B minor. So we know BDF is root, off, off. Minor is root, off, or down, and then up, so a natural fifth. So we just take that fifth and flip it up to F sharp, and then now we have B minor, B, D, F sharp. So root, down, up, B, D, F sharp. And then to go to B major, same thing. We have to take the third and flip it up. So D becomes D sharp. So B major is B, D sharp, F sharp. So there you go. You know, B diminished, B, D, F, B minor, B, D, F sharp, B major, B, D sharp, F sharp. When you take the note that's a natural note that's already starting as minor, when you flip it up, that means you have to sharp it. For illustration purposes, we can run through some other examples. Let's try E major. Think about it for a second. Now I'll walk you through it. So the first thing you do is say like, okay, what do we know that starts with E already? So we're in the key of C, we know all those chords and so on in the key of C. E is EGB, and we know that's E minor. So it goes root and then down up, but we want to make major, so we want to take the middle switch, the third, and flip it up to get E, G sharp, B, and that's E major. Next example is going to be F minor. So in the key, well, let me give you a chance. Go ahead and think about it. I'll tell you about F minor. So we already know F major, FAC, and we know that major is root, then up, up. But we want minor, so we want root and flip it down and then up, so root, down, up. So we have FAC, we take that third and flip it down to A flat, so F minor is F, A flat, C. Another example, how about A diminished? What's A diminished? Okay, so we know that our A chord in C is A minor, so it's ACE and that's minor. And minor is root and then down switch and then up switch. But diminished, we want root and then down, down. So we take the fifth, the E, and we flip it down to E flat. So A diminished is A, C, E flat. Okay, so last one. What is G major? So that's kind of a trick question. You should already know that one. G major is in the key of C. It's already a major chord, GBD. No sharps or flats. So at this point, as you can see, hopefully you can spell any chord, major, minor, or diminished, as long as the root of the chord is a natural note. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, major, minor, diminished, you can spell all those. It's like 21 chords you can spell off the bat. The other chords you got to worry about, of course, are when the root is an accidental. So when the root is a sharp or a flat. How do you spell like A sharp minor, for example, or how do you spell B flat major? Process is the same. The first thing you do, though, is you just ignore that sharp or flat, and then you add it in at the end. So, for example, let's say we want to spell, I don't know, what do we want to spell? C sharp minor. So the first thing you do is just ignore the sharp and focus on the C, and you say, what chord do we know in the key of C that begins with C, and that's C, C, E, G, and that's C major. We want a minor chord, same as before. So we go from two up switches to down up. So that gives us C, E flat, G. We know that C minor is C, E flat, G. But we want C sharp minor. So you just take each of those three notes, C, E flat, G, and sharp them. So the natural notes become sharp and the flat note becomes natural. So it becomes C sharp, E, G. C sharp, E, G sharp, I mean. And that's all it is. Another example, maybe a really common chord, of course, is B flat major, and it's the same process. So we know from the key of C that B, D, F is B diminished, and we want a major chord. Diminished is root, down, down. We want to flip those two up. So it becomes B, D sharp, F sharp. But we want B flat major, not B major. B major is B, D sharp, F sharp. We want B flat major, so we flat all three of those notes. So B becomes B flat, D sharp becomes D, F sharp becomes F. So B flat, D, F, and that's B flat major. One thing to watch out for is dealing with double sharps and double flats and trying to avoid that. So for example, if somebody says, hey, what's A sharp major? And so you know, like A major is A, C sharp, E. And then if you want to sharp everything, you would have A sharp, and then C is already sharp. And so what do you do with that? Make it D, make it C double sharp, and then E is sharp. So you couldn't really make it D because, you know, when you spell the chords, you skip every other note. So you can't have D as the third of an A chord because D is the fourth. The best strategy to avoid double sharp is just use the enharmonic equivalent of A sharp, and that's B flat. So you would just spell that chord as B flat. So B flat DF would be the preferred spelling of like A sharp major, which technically can exist, but it's usually better to avoid it. The same would be true for like double flat. If you had a minor chord like C flat minor or something, like C double flat, G flat, C flat double flat, G flat is what it would be. Now you'd want to avoid that E double flat. So instead of using like C flat, maybe you would just call that B minor. Okay, last thing is augmented chords. And we talked about major, minor, diminished. Augmented is similar to major, except instead of a fifth, there's a sharp fifth. So it goes root, third, sharp fifth, so root and then up. And then with the sharp fifth, we've only covered like natural 5 is on, and then off is flat 5. And so we'd have to add an extra position. So it's a 3-way switch for the 5 and instead of just a 2, so you have that extra sharp 5. So the formula is like root and then up and then like way up or whatever for that last sharp 5. So for C augmented, it would be C, E, G sharp. So C major is C, E, G. C augmented is C, E, G sharp. I don't know, A augmented, A, C sharp, E is A major. So A, C sharp, E sharp is A augmented. And I know I just talked about how you should avoid like double sharps, but when you sharp that 5, you can't always avoid double sharps. It's just part of the thing when you're spelling an augmented chord. So for example, if like in the case of B major is B, D sharp, F sharp. So B augmented would be B, D sharp, F double sharp. There's no way to avoid it. Why bother with any of this stuff, learning how to spell the chords? Basically, it saves you a lot of time in the long run. And I think the way I've shown it here is simple and easy to approach. It was for me anyway. So it's a small investment of time in the beginning. And what I mean by it saves you a lot of time in the long run is that I think most music, if you're like me, most music you come across is going to be based around some chords. They might be simple triads like we discussed here, or they might be like 7th chords or 9th chords or things like that. But you're going to find, you know, the chords themselves or the melody lines or solo lines over those chords are going to have those chord tones in them. So instead of every time you find something new, having to completely memorize it as something completely new and different, you might just be like, oh, well, I recognize there's an E here and a B here and a G sharp here, so he's doing like an E major thing. Or if it's some new weird chord voicing that you've never seen, you just ask yourself, okay, well, what are the notes here that he's playing? Okay, there's an F, there's a B flat, there's a C, and there's an A. And so it's some kind of like F major thing with a B flat in there. And I've never seen anybody voice that, but it's like an F major kind of thing. I know what he's doing. So it just makes things that are completely foreign and weird. It shows you like kind of the grid or the system behind it that you can attach these new ideas to and not have to just be learning everything like from the ground up every time. So that's what I mean when I say it saves you a lot of time in the long run. It's really also helpful to know the notes on the fretboard because that's how you know what actually notes you're playing. So I was studying, I had a couple years ago, I think, it finally dawned on me, I need to learn this. And so this is the video I found that was helpful for me to learn that. The guy just presents this simple method to do it. And that's another thing that's really been helpful. Just basic knowledge that people should probably have, you know, if they want to like kind of learn stuff in the long run. What's the other thing? I tell you what, I'll recommend you something to listen to before we go because that was just an idea I had when I was jogging earlier today. It's called the Kindaichi Mystery Band. It's this Japanese thing. So Kindaichi was this big like mystery character, a fictional detective in Japanese literature. I have to look it up on Wikipedia again. I can't remember all the ins and outs of it. But they made a TV show for it in the 70s. He's kind of like Sherlock Holmes or something. I never actually read it. I don't know anything about it. But the soundtrack was written and recorded by this thing called Kindaichi Mystery Band. And it's fun to listen to if you haven't heard it, so I recommend that. Anyway, enjoy that, and until next time.